In a unique instance within the British railway network, the western region of the former Great Western Main Line out of London Paddington decided that, as part of the widespread replacement of steam locomotives during the 1950s and 60s, that it would replace its venerable fleet of kings, castles and halls with diesel hydraulic rather than diesel-electric traction. This would give rise to a small but notable series of individual classes that powered a variety of passenger and freight workies throughout the years, ranging from the mixed traffic Class 35 Hymek to the premier Class 42 Warships and flagship Class 52 Westerns, only for standardisation in the early 1970s to render these machines redundant after only a decade of use. The Western region's decision to pursue diesel hydraulic traction was grounded in a serious, carefully considered effort by regional management and engineering staff to identify the most appropriate and effective solution to the very real and pressing technical and operational problems posed by the transition away from steam, as engendered by the 1955 Modernisation Plan, a sweeping and ambitious programme unveiled by British Railways with the aim of bringing the rail network into the post-war industrial age. The intention was to phase out steam power in favour of newer forms of traction, namely diesel and electric, but this move presented enormous logistical, financial and engineering challenges, with electrification, while theoretically offering the greatest long-term efficiencies and performance benefits, being considered economically unviable for widespread implementation in the short term due to the immense capital cost of installing overhead line equipment or third rail systems over such a vast network. Thus, only the busiest and most profitable routes were deemed suitable candidates for immediate electrification, leaving the rest of the system, particularly regions like the west of England and South Wales, dependent on diesel traction for the foreseeable future. The Western region, which inherited the extensive and complex former Great Western Railway network, had to contend with some particularly challenging topography, with many of its most important routes, especially those west of Exeter, being characterised by steep gradients, tight curves and frequent changes in elevation, with this terrain placing high demands on motive power and required locomotives with strong acceleration, high adhesion and a good power-to-weight ratio. The early diesel-electric locomotives being introduced under the pilot schemes, while technically advanced in their own way, failed to impress the Western region's engineers, with these machines being heavy, typically exceeding 130 tons, slow to respond to throttle inputs, and underwhelming in their ability to haul express passenger services at consistently high speeds over undulating routes, with their real-world performance being barely an improvement over the very best of the steam locomotives they were supposed to replace, such as the Castles and the Kings. Faced with these limitations, the Western region's engineering leadership, known for its strong technical tradition and independent thinking, began to investigate alternatives, looking beyond Britain to developments taking place on the continent, particularly in West Germany, where Deutsche Bundesbahn had introduced a new class of mainline diesel hydraulic locomotives known as the V200s. These German machines were proving highly successful in daily service and offered a compelling combination of high power output, relatively low overall weight, and mechanical simplicity, a key to their success being their use of lightweight stress skin construction, which eliminated the need for a heavy chassis and allowed for a much lighter overall vehicle. The powertrain, consisting of twin Maybach high-speed diesel engines connected to compact Voith hydraulic transmissions, provided excellent performance in a relatively small and lightweight package, with the Western region being particularly impressed by the V200's ability to maintain high average speeds over hilly terrain, something that mirrored the demands of their own network. The German design philosophy was radically different from that being pursued in Britain, as while British diesel-electric locomotives relied on large slow-revving engines connected to bulky generators and traction motors, the German approach favoured smaller, faster-revving engines coupled with fluid transmissions, with this arrangement not only reducing weight, but also simplifying maintenance and offering better dynamic performance in certain operating contexts. Crucially, the V200s demonstrated weight savings of up to 30 tons compared to equivalent British diesel electrics, providing a lighter locomotive that resulted in less track wear, greater fuel efficiency, and the ability to haul longer trains without breaching axle load limits, and for the Western region, always conscious of the limitations imposed by route availability and bridge weight restrictions on its older infrastructure, these advantages were enormously attractive. Recognizing the potential benefits of diesel hydraulic technology, the Western region made a strong case to the British Transport Commission, or BTC, for the adoption of such locomotives in their area, though the BTC, committed to a policy of centralized procurement and deeply skeptical of regional variation, were not immediately receptive, with the Commission preferring standardisation and was wary of importing foreign technology wholesale, especially during a time when British industry was expected to lead the modernisation effort. As a result, the initial diesel hydraulic orders placed for the Western region were something of a compromise, with the North British Locomotive Company, based in Glasgow, having secured licenses to build both the Voith transmissions and MAN diesel engines used in the German designs, and thus were therefore selected to provide two types of diesel hydraulic locomotives for the pilot scheme, a Type 4 twin-engine locomotive that would become the D600 Warship class, and a smaller single-engine Type 2 locomotive, later known as the D6300 class or Baby Warship. From the very beginning, the D600 Warship class locomotives were seen as misfits within the Western region, being considered by many as both short-sighted and politically motivated, with there being a strong sense among railway staff and enthusiasts alike that the Commission had simply overridden regional priorities and secretly wanted the project to fail in order to validate their preference for diesel-electric designs, and in doing so, they gave the region just enough autonomy to implement their ideas, but not the freedom to do so successfully. All 5 locomotives, numbered D600 through to D604, were equipped with twin MAN L12 V18 21A V12 engines, each delivering 1,000 horsepower, with the first 2 sets of engines being manufactured by MAN in Germany, while the remaining engines were produced under license by NBL itself, with these engines being coupled to Voith L306R hydraulic transmissions. The transmissions allowed for automatic gear changes at preset speeds, 29 miles an hour and 57 miles an hour, which were intended to optimize performance without the need for manual intervention, while the wheel arrangement was A1A, with the central axle on each bogie being unpowered, reducing tractive effort but keeping the axle load within acceptable limits for the routes they were meant to serve. The D600s were engineered to an almost excessive degree of robustness, with the underframe being constructed using heavy I-section beams and steel crossmembers, all of which were riveted and welded together to form a formidable base, with this being topped with a thick sheet steel floor and finished with an aluminium body, the result being a locomotive with an overall weight of 117.4 tons, making them significantly heavier than the German counterparts and arguably overbuilt for their intended roles. Despite their mass, they were visually distinctive, carrying the standard BR green livery, complemented by a blue-grey line running along the lower edge of the body sides, while their names were assigned alphabetically and honoured famous Royal Navy warships, Active, Ark Royal, Bulldog, Conquest and Cossack, with one of their most unusual physical features being their use of spoked wheels, a design choice that harked back to earlier traction eras and was not commonly found on post-steam locomotives. Alongside the D600s, the D6300 Baby Warships also emerged amid similar scrutiny, with the BTC's rationale being to use the D6300s as the hydraulic equivalent of the 1,000 horsepower diesel-electric Class 21 locomotives being built concurrently by the North British Locomotive Company, with the first 6 D6300s being constructed by NBL in Glasgow and fitted with a single MAN L12 V18 21A 12-cylinder diesel engine capable of delivering 1,000 horsepower, which was paired with a Voith L306R hydraulic transmission. However, similarly to the D600s, when it came to the chassis and structural design, the results were far from ideal, with the underframes being constructed with the robustness of a military vehicle, using large I-section beams and riveted crossmembers, all tied together with heavy-duty welds and topped with a thick steel plate floor, though to offset some of this mass, aluminium was used for the body panels, but even this failed to prevent the final weight of each unit from reaching a hefty 68 tons. Although D6300, the first of the class, was not delivered until January 1959, the BTC, with considerable optimism, placed a follow-up order for a further 52 locomotives back in November 1957, with this bold move representing the largest single order for diesel locomotives in British railway history, with the production locomotives, unlike the pilot batch, being fitted with the slightly more powerful MAN L12 V18 21B engines, capable of producing 1,100 horsepower, while the troublesome Spanner Mark I steam heating boilers fitted to the first 6 units were replaced with either Clayton or Stone Vapor models. However, from their earliest outings on the network, the D600s and D6300s were beset with technical niggles and reliability concerns, and although their problems were not catastrophic, they were frequent enough to cause operational headaches, with small faults with the engines and transmissions beginning to surface within months of entering service. Under the terms of their supply contract, defective parts had to be sent back to North British for rectification, and while this may have made sense on paper, in practice it meant long delays in getting locomotives back into working order, as repairs could not be completed on-site or by BR's own depots, while adding to the unreliability was the presence of the Spanner Mark Ia steam heating boilers, which were notorious for their unreliability and became a particular liability during the winter months. On average, each locomotive required a complete engine replacement after only 8,000 hours of use, a short lifespan by railway standards, particularly given that these engines were expected to clock up roughly 40,000 miles per year for the D6300 and 65,000 miles per year for the D600s, thus meaning that many units were effectively sidelined before they could even complete a full year's expected workload. While by 1961 the reliability of the class had improved somewhat, their reputation had already taken a hit, and with the more numerous and far more successful D800 Warship class beginning to take over the routes and services for which the D600s had originally been earmarked, the earlier locomotives were quietly moved to less demanding secondary roles, including freight and local passenger duties, areas where their performance was not critical and their deficiencies less obvious. The D6300s, meanwhile, were equally tarnished, and due to their non-standard nature, combined with the arrival of more powerful and standardised diesel hydraulics like the D800 Warships and D7000 Hymeks, meant that the D6300s were increasingly sidelined to secondary duties, while the collapse of NBL in the early 1960s only added to the class's woes, as spare parts became more difficult to obtain, and from then on, withdrawn locomotives were routinely stripped of any usable components in order to keep the others running. By December 1967, the end had come for the D600s, with all units withdrawn from service, having served for more than a decade on the rails, with scrapping soon following, with D600 Active and D601 Ark Royal being sold to the well-known scrapyard of Wooden Brothers in Barry, South Wales, while the remaining three, D602 Bulldog, D603 Conquest and D604 Cossack, were transported to Cashmore's yard in Newport, where they were cut up during 1968. D600 itself survived a little longer, finally being scrapped in March 1970, while D601 Ark Royal was the subject of an attempted preservation effort, but like many early heritage initiatives, it struggled with lack of funding, storage challenges, and a general lack of public interest, and the locomotive remained at Barry for over 10 years, steadily deteriorating until it too was finally scrapped in July 1980. For the D6300s, the first unit, D6301, was withdrawn in December 1967, while another 26 units were withdrawn the following year in 1968, reflecting both the growing availability of newer locomotives and the growing impracticality of keeping the D6300s in traffic, though a temporary reprieve followed, as owing to delays in the delivery of replacement diesel-electric locomotives, some of the remaining baby warships were kept in service for a further 2 years, bridging the gap while more modern motive power came online, and by January 1972, the final 4 members of the class, D6333, D336, D338, and D339, were officially retired from service, with none being preserved. Nevertheless, amid the fallout of the Western region's contentious procurement process with the BTC, a compromise was reached wherein the Western region management would be allowed to appeal to Krauss-Maffei of Germany to develop a domesticated version of the V200 for the UK rail network, with the engineering team at Swindon being granted a license. However, this adaptation was far from straightforward, as with the German V200 having been designed to much larger continental loading gauge standards, the British loading gauge, being approximately 10 inches lower and 6 inches narrower than its German counterpart, forced a significant reworking of the internal layout, but despite these constraints, the British version was designed to retain the same twin-engine, twin-transmission layout as the original. Swindon's engineers were therefore required to cram 2 large engines and 2 equally substantial hydraulic transmissions into a body significantly more compact than the original design, with this compromise later becoming a defining characteristic of the class, with a tight, cramped engine room that made maintenance challenging throughout their working lives. The power units chosen were Maybach MD650 diesel engines, each producing 1,035 horsepower in the initial pilot locomotives, with these early examples, D800 to D802, being authorized by the BTC in January 1956, and represented a new engineering direction for the Western region, drawing on principles seen in aviation, with the D800s being built using the stressed skin construction of the V200s. This meant that thin steel and aluminium panels, carefully welded and riveted, formed not just the body shell but also part of the structural framework, while running the length of the locomotive were steel tubes acting as longitudinal members, providing strength while keeping the overall weight down to under 80 tons, this being vital not only for meeting route availability requirements, but also to maximize speed and acceleration, while the bogies were derived from the German design used on the V200, a decision that would have mixed results in operational service. Encouraged by what they saw in the prototypes, despite not having yet proven themselves in full service, the BTC issued a full production order before any of the initial locomotives had turned a wheel in revenue service, and in February 1957, Swindon Works was tasked with building 30 further locomotives, which would be numbered from D803 to D832. Unlike the earlier batch, these units were fitted with slightly more powerful engines, an uprated version of the Maybach MD650, delivering 1,135 horsepower per engine, with this increase in power being aimed to address early concerns about performance, particularly on long-distance express services, with one locomotive in this production run, D830, being an outlier, as rather than being equipped with Maybach engines, it was fitted with Paxman 12 YJX engines of equivalent power, as an attempt to explore the viability of using a domestically designed and built engine instead of relying on German designs and licenses. In July 1958, even before D800 had completed its trials, a further development occurred as the North British Locomotive Company was contracted to produce another batch of 33 locomotives, numbered D833 to D865, with these units representing their Swindon-built counterparts externally, but were completely different underneath, as instead of the Maybach and McHydro combination, these locomotives were powered by MAN L12 V1821B diesel engines, each producing 1,100 horsepower, and used Voith LT306R hydraulic transmissions. This choice created a fundamental division in the class, with the Swindon-built locomotives using one engine and transmission type, while the NBL locomotives used another, and though the engines were broadly similar in terms of mounting and configuration, the transmissions were not interchangeable, limiting operational flexibility and complicating maintenance routines. A final, smaller order followed in April 1959, adding 5 more locomotives to the fleet, D866 to D870, which were again built at Swindon, with these final examples being expected to fit within the existing naming sequence, which had followed an alphabetical system based on Royal Navy warship names, starting with D803 Albion, with the expectation being that the last locomotive in the class would be D865 to be named Zenith. When the order for 5 more units was unexpectedly added, the naming system hit a snag, and Swindon had to hurriedly find 5 more suitable Royal Navy names beginning with the letter Z, a task made more difficult by the limited pool of historically appropriate names, and in order to preserve the alphabetical continuity, 2 locomotives, D864 and D865, had their intended names changed, with the only major break from the naval naming tradition being D812, which bore the name the Royal Naval Reserve 1859-1959, as a commemorative gesture marking the centenary of that institution. Visually, the warships made a bold impression, with all units being delivered in standard BR green livery with a light grey waist-level stripe, offering a clean, modern aesthetic that contrasted sharply with the grime and bulk of the steam locomotives they were replacing, while later builds, specifically those numbered D859 to D865, featured small yellow panels around the headcoat boxes as part of an evolving safety scheme to improve visibility. Service entry began with D800 in August 1958, though initial optimism was quickly tempered by teething troubles, with one of the first issues to arise concerning the steam heating boilers, which suffered from poor ventilation within the confined engine compartments, thus leading to overheating and, in some cases, outright failure of the heating system, an essential feature for passenger comfort during winter. Engineers addressed this by adding ventilation grills to the roof panels above the boiler, a modification first applied to the NBL-built units, but eventually retrofitted across the fleet, while in parallel, the engine temperature relays were recalibrated, as previously, if the engine temperature exceeded 90 degrees Celsius, the relays would shut down the engine completely, with the revised system allowing the engine to idle in such circumstances, maintaining some power while cooling down, thereby avoiding sudden and complete failures en route. Soon, a far more serious problem emerged in relation to high-speed stability, with the locomotives having been designed with a maximum speed of 90 miles an hour in mind, and it was expected that they would operate comfortably at these speeds, but in practice, any speed above 80 miles an hour revealed unpleasant and potentially dangerous handling characteristics, with this instability being traced to the bogies, which are direct derivatives of the German V200 design. This issue hadn't manifested in Germany, where speed limits were generally lower, and the V200 rarely exceeded 75 miles an hour, while on British tracks, especially with poorer maintenance and tighter curves, the locomotives began to exhibit pronounced lurching and hunting oscillations at high speed, with these dynamic forces being felt not only by the crews, but also put stress on the track and the vehicle itself. In response, Swindon redesigned the bogies entirely by 1963, incorporating hydraulic dampers and improved mounting systems, with this modification significantly improving ride quality and stability, and the upgraded bogies were also used on the subsequent Class 52 Western locomotives. The early part of this period saw the Warships in regular and prominent use on prestigious named trains such as the Cornish Riviera Express and the Torbay Express, where they quickly became a familiar and trusted presence on the Western region's most high-profile services, with their rapid acceleration and ability to maintain consistently high average speeds over long distances, making them ideally suited to the demands of tight and ambitious timetables. By 1964, a significant deployment of warships had taken place on the Waterloo to Exeter route, with this change following the transfer of the line from the southern region to the western region, marking a shift in both operational control and locomotive strategy, with the western region, having gained the line, taking swift steps to stamp its identity on the route. One of the first decisions was to withdraw the once famous Atlantic Coast Express, a flagship service of the Southern Railway, which had run far beyond Exeter to multiple destinations in the West Country, and in its place, the warships were tasked with hauling a new set of semi-fast services, while to maximise efficiency and reduce operating costs, large stretches of track west of Salisbury were reduced to single lines, with the redundant land often sold off. At the same time, although the Swindon-built locomotives generally built up a reliable service record, the same could not be said for the North British locomotives, with the MAN engines and Voith transmissions fitted to these units proving less robust than the Maybach-McHydro combination used in the Swindon examples, with this problem compounded by NBL's collapse in 1962, and as a result, the NBL warships were gradually sidelined from express passenger workings and reassigned to lighter duties, including freight and less demanding secondary services, where their performance was more acceptable. The Westerns, meanwhile, took shape in the latter part of the 1950s, when operational experience began to show that the earlier warship classes were not powerful enough to replace steam locomotives on Premier Express duties, particularly those previously handled by the Kings, and faced with the need for a step change in performance, the Western region looked again to Germany, this time seeking inspiration from the 3,000 horsepower Krauss-Maffei ML3000 prototype, a twin-engine diesel hydraulic design undergoing successful trials on the continent. Drawing from this, the region's engineers opted for two Maybach MD655 engines, each developing 1,380 horsepower, paired with Voith L630RV hydraulic transmissions, but due to the added weight and size of the engines and transmissions, the Westerns were designed with six-wheel bogies instead of the four-wheeled arrangement used on earlier types, while the body shells were constructed using a stressed skin design, which not only reduced weight but also improved the structural integrity of the locomotives. This engineering approach helped to counterbalance the weight of the twin-engine layout and maintain acceptable axle loadings, allowing the locomotives to operate effectively across the region's varied network, while construction of the new class was divided between two works, Swindon, which had long been the Western region's engineering hub, and Crewe, which had previously focused on electric and diesel-electric types. Swindon was initially set to build the first 40 locomotives, but when delays and design finalizations caused pressure on resources, 5 of its allocated builds were reassigned to Crewe, and in the end, Swindon built numbers D1000 to D1029, while Crewe turned out D1030 to D1073. The first locomotive, D1000 Western Enterprise, rolled out in December 1961 and immediately drew attention, not just because of its mechanical layout, but because of its highly unusual and experimental appearance, with the locomotive painted in a desert sand livery with black bogies, red buffer beams, and bold cast number plates, thus making it look unlike anything previously seen on Britain's railways. This visual impact was deliberate, the result of input from the newly formed design panel, which had been tasked with helping to modernise British Rail's public image, with the remaining locomotives receiving a variety of liveries in the early years, with D1001 being outshopped in maroon, and D1002 to 004 in all-over green. But ultimately, British Railways, through public competition, settled on maroon as this was the most popular colour, and all other examples were given this treatment with the exception of D1015 Western Champion, which was outshopped in gold and ochre with the buffer beams painted in red. The entry of the Westerns into frontline service proved to be both exciting and challenging, with their twin Maybach engines giving them a distinctive sound and powerful acceleration, and they were generally well liked by crews for their speed and responsiveness, though it quickly became clear that the locomotives were suffering from significant teething problems. By early 1962, reports were coming in of bogie-related faults, especially around the carton shafts and suspension, with excessive lateral movement between the bogies and the locomotive frame, causing stress on the drive shafts and led to premature wear, while quality control issues during the manufacture of components also began to surface, particularly in the construction of the Maybach engines, which were built under license by Bristol Siddeley in Britain. Materials not matching original design specifications were sometimes used, and certain parts, such as roller bearings, were found to be substandard, with these problems resulting in a string of early failures and, in turn, a cautious approach from BR's engineering departments, and due to the problems with the bogies and overall ride quality, a blanket speed restriction of 80 miles an hour was imposed on the class until corrective modifications could be made. In response, a comprehensive program of engineering changes was rolled out, including the strengthening of torque arms, replacement of rubber side blocks with more robust metal components, and redesign of several internal systems, and thus, over time, these improvements restored confidence in the locomotives, and by 1964 most of the class had had their 90-mile-an-hour capability reinstated. Despite these setbacks, the Western soon became a familiar sight on key express services, particularly those running between Paddington and Birmingham, and further afield to Shrewsbury and South Wales, with their striking looks, consistently applied naming scheme beginning with the word Western, and distinctive presence, ensuring they were enthusiasts' favourites, even while they remained under scrutiny for their mechanical reliability. However, as the fleet expanded and settled into regular service, it became increasingly obvious that their long-term prospects were being shaped by forces beyond the Western region's control, as nationally, British Rail was moving towards a policy of standardisation in traction, favouring the simplicity and versatility of diesel-electric types. The Brush Type 4, later known as Class 47, began proving its worth as a reliable, low-maintenance locomotive that could be used almost anywhere on the network, with its comparative simplicity, combined with the logistical advantages of electric train heating and universal compatibility, making it a natural fit for a rationalised and centralised railway system, while the Westerns, by contrast, remained regionally confined, tied to depots familiar with hydraulic maintenance, and unable to operate in electrified or non-hydraulic areas without specialised support. In 1963, a more serious mechanical problem emerged when engineers discovered that the roller bearings in the hydraulic transmissions were wearing at an accelerated rate, raising safety concerns and triggering a fleet-wide withdrawal for urgent modification, and although the Westerns returned to service after the issue was addressed, their reputation within senior BR circles had already been dented, and what had started as an ambitious and technically bold regional initiative was now increasingly viewed as an expensive anomaly, one that no longer aligned with the centrally driven priorities of British Rail's emerging future. Nevertheless, despite British Rail's misgivings towards diesel hydraulic transmission, one final class of mainline locomotives for the Western region would emerge in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and marked an ambitious and somewhat unconventional attempt to create a medium-powered diesel hydraulic locomotive that leaned heavily on British design, British manufacturing practices, and homegrown expertise. Instead of being closely modelled on established German designs, the Hymeks were distinct, utilising a domestically developed body and layout while still drawing upon German technical knowledge in the form of licensed components, being developed by a specially formed consortium, Beyer-Peacock Hymek Limited, which was a collaboration between locomotive builders Beyer-Peacock and Company, engine specialists Bristol Siddeley Engines, and transmission manufacturers Stone Platte Industries. At their heart was a single Maybach MD870 V16 diesel engine, capable of producing 1,740 horsepower, coupled with a Macydro K184U hydraulic transmission system, an arrangement that made them the most powerful single-engine diesel hydraulic locomotives in the country at the time of their introduction. In the context of the Modernisation era, Beyer-Peacock saw a gap in BR's traction strategy, as while Type 2s such as the Class 31 offered up to 1,250 horsepower, and Type 4s like the Class 47 offered well over 2,000 horsepower, there was no designated Type 3 machine in the 1,500 to 1,750 horsepower range, and seizing this opportunity, the consortium proposed a design that would provide a vital mid-range option, powerful enough for secondary express work and heavy freight, yet light and economical enough for more routine tasks. Manufacturing of the Hymeks began at the historic Gorton Works in Manchester, a long-established facility associated with Beyer-Peacock, with the first unit, numbered D6000, being completed and formally handed over to British Railways in May 1961, almost 2 months ahead of schedule, with the initial order, placed in June 1959, being for 45 locomotives, and such was the confidence in the project that a further 50 were ordered less than a year later, followed by a final batch of 6 units in late 1961. This brought the total number of Hymeks constructed to 101, with the last unit, D7100, finally emerging from Gorton in early 1964 after production delays, while across the production run, subtle but notable design changes were implemented, with early examples fitted with stone vapor train heating boilers and Knorr braking systems, while later locomotives received Spanner Mark IIIA boilers and Westinghouse braking equipment. Likewise, air horns originally mounted beneath the buffer beam on the first few locomotives were later repositioned to the cab roof for improved audibility and standardisation, while aesthetic distinctions also featured prominently in their design, with all members delivered in the striking BR Brunswick green livery, offset by a light green waist stripe and ivory white window surrounds, a level of detail and colour contrast that made the Hymeks stand out from many of their contemporaries. The Hymeks were initially allocated to the Western region's principal depots, including Old Oak Common, Cardiff Campden and Bristol Bath Road, and were quickly pressed into duty on a wide variety of services, with their first regular assignments including semi-fast passenger trains, such as the Paddington to Hereford route, and inter-regional services across South Wales and the west of England, with these early workings proving to be well within the locomotive's capabilities, and they soon gained a reputation for being smooth, reliable and relatively straightforward to operate. Encouraged by this, BR began deploying them on more demanding diagrams, including high-profile express services between Paddington and Cardiff or Swansea, where they displaced even the venerable King-class steam locomotives, and although the Hymeks were not ideally suited for these top-linked jobs due to their lower power rating, they nonetheless acquitted themselves respectably until more powerful locomotives like the Class 52 Westerns and Brush-Type 4s became available and pushed them back to their intended niche. However, the early period of Hymek operation was not without setbacks, as towards the end of 1961, serious reliability issues began to emerge, particularly involving overheating engines and transmission faults on startup. And to investigate the root causes, the fleet was split into two experimental groups, one which had its Maybach engines derated to 1,350 horsepower, while the other had its first gear disabled to avoid transmission strain. Eventually, engineers traced the problem to flaws in the control gear that governed gear changes within the McHydro transmission units, and at certain engine speeds, the gear changes failed to engage correctly, leading to overheating and mechanical stress. But once the control gear was reinforced and standardized across the fleet, performance stabilized and the locomotives returned to normal working conditions by late 1963. Throughout the remainder of the early 1960s, the Hymeks established themselves as a reliable and versatile component of the Western region's fleet, working an impressive variety of duties including stopping passenger services, fast freights, parcels and engineers' trains, with their design allowing for reasonable route availability, and their use spread across key routes from London to Bristol, South Wales, Worcester, Hereford and beyond. Yet despite this versatility, operational difficulties occasionally arose when the Hymeks were tasked with working far from their regional base, as outside of the Western region, maintenance facilities and trained personnel familiar with hydraulic traction were in short supply, and if a Hymek failed or required crew change in a non-Western region depot, there was often no one qualified to handle it, resulting in delays or rushed returns to Western region tracks. Additionally, while they were equipped to work in multiple with each other using a coded electro-pneumatic system marked by a distinctive yellow triangle, this arrangement was limited to controlling just one additional locomotive, and if 3 locomotives were required on a single train, the third would need a separate driver. The Hymeks enjoyed the benefits of a relatively uncomplicated and robust layout, with the Maybach MD870 engines performing well once initial teething problems were addressed, delivering respectable service life and ease of maintenance, though the McHydro transmissions remained the weak link, frequently succumbing to issues such as stripped gears, clutch damage, torque converter failures and oil contamination. The result was a chronic shortage of spare transmissions, which led to a cycle of part swapping between locomotives to keep the active roster at full strength. But despite these challenges, the Hymeks often outperformed expectations, particularly once their duties were shifted to lighter work for which they were better suited. And by the mid-1960s, they had arguably become the most consistently reliable of all British diesel hydraulic classes. Nevertheless, the long-term future of the diesel hydraulics was already in doubt, for as early as 1966, the closure of Beyer-Peacock deprived BR of a vital source of technical support and spare parts for the Hymeks, while policy changes at the highest levels of railway management, in the form of the 1967 National Traction Plan, meant BR committed to reducing the number of diesel classes in service, prioritising standardisation and reliability. Thus, anything considered non-standard, including all diesel hydraulic types, was now a target for withdrawal, with the introduction of newer rolling stock that required electric train supply further limiting the hydraulic's usefulness, as most examples lacked the necessary equipment to power such coaches, and from that point on, their withdrawal became a matter of when, not if. Around this time, the Warships, designated Class 42 under tops, faced the withdrawal of their first examples during 1968, with the retirement of the three Swindon-built pilot locomotives, D800, D801 and D802, with these early units being sufficiently different in both mechanical layout and electrical systems to make them increasingly impractical to operate and maintain alongside the rest of the class. Their withdrawal foreshadowed the direction that would soon be taken for the entire fleet, and the following year, the 830 Majestic followed, a unique machine within the class fitted with Paxman Ventura engines, which had failed to deliver the performance or reliability required, while alongside D830, three locomotives built by the North British Locomotive Company also bowed out. However, the early 1970s saw a shortage of available locomotives across the British rail network, particularly in the Western region, and thus provided an unexpected reprieve for a number of locomotives which had otherwise been marked for withdrawal, with some units being returned to frontline service despite being in a visibly poor external condition and suffering from mechanical wear. Nevertheless, by the end of 1971, the tide had turned decisively, and in that year alone, 45 members of the class, more than three-quarters of the surviving fleet, were withdrawn from service and sent for disposal, with this cull including all remaining North British-built Class 43 warships, whose man engines and voice transmissions have become a significant burden due to reliability concerns and the lack of spare parts. January 1972 marked the final act in the operational story of the warships, with a further 9 locomotives being removed from traffic at the start of the year, though once again, operational demands necessitated the temporary reinstatement of 3 of these units, though these last survivors were, by this point, in a lamentable state, with their bodywork often being filthy and corroded, their paint faded or chipped away, and many ran without their original nameplates or other identifying features. Regardless, they soldiered on, covering services with diminishing effectiveness until their final withdrawal, with the last to be retired being D832 Onslaught, which formally exited service at the end of 1972, drawing a close to this chapter of experimentation and independent thinking within British diesel development. Preservation efforts, while limited, proved to be quietly determined, and, in a few cases, remarkably successful, with D821 Greyhound holding the distinction of being the first ex-British Rail mainline diesel locomotive to be preserved, which came about under unusual circumstances, as the Diesel Traction Group had initially arranged to purchase Class 22 D6319 for preservation. However, due to a mix-up at Swindon Works, the locomotive was inadvertently scrapped before it could be collected, and in an effort to make amends, British Rail offered the group a choice of several warships that had not yet been disposed of, including D810, D812, D821 and D832, and after inspection, D821 was selected primarily because it was in the best mechanical condition, and therefore offered the greatest prospect of successful restoration, being acquired in 1973 and would eventually find a long-term home on the Severn Valley Railway. D832 Onslaught, which had the honour of being the final warship in regular traffic, was saved separately, initially being retained by British Rail and used by the Railway Technical Centre in Derby for research and testing, before being eventually acquired by preservationists and taken to the East Lancashire Railway, with the restoration of D832 to full operational condition being made possible in large part thanks to the availability of spare parts salvaged from its sister D818 Glory. The 818 itself had a more ambiguous fate, as after withdrawal, it was kept at Swindon as something of a display item, and was repainted from its later BR blue livery back into its original BR green, and during this period, it attracted considerable interest from enthusiasts and workers at the site, and for a time there was hope that it might eventually be preserved, but no formal preservation plans came to fruition, and with no firm offer and the works facing closure, the 818 was cut up in 1985. For the Hymeks, withdrawal began in understated fashion in 1971, accelerating through 1972, with more than three-quarters of the class having been taken out of service by the end of that year, though the replacement locomotives, mostly Class 31 diesel electrics, were themselves not without issue, and due to early reliability problems encountered with the Class 31s, this meant that a handful of Hymeks scheduled for withdrawal remained in service longer than expected simply because they were more dependable. This temporary reprieve did little to change the bigger picture, however, and by 1973, the number of surviving Hymeks had been reduced to just 10, with the remaining samples split between Old Oak Common in London and Bristol Bath Road, with their continued operation being more a matter of operational convenience than strategic necessity, and as spares became harder to obtain, the Hymeks began to be cannibalized to keep others running. Despite their dwindling numbers, the Hymeks remained popular with enthusiasts, with British Rail capitalising on this residual affection by organising a farewell rail tour dubbed the Hymeks Swan Song on September 22, 1973, with this tour being hauled by locomotives D7001 and D7028, both of which were among the dwindling pool of operational units. Ironically, while the rail tour marked the symbolic end of the class, other Hymeks continued to perform revenue-earning duties into the following year, with 6 locomotives surviving into 1975, with D7028 being withdrawn in January of that year, followed by D7029 in February, and the final 4, D7011, D7017, D7018, and D7022, being stood down in March. After that, no Hymeks remained in active BR service, with a handful continuing to exist on BR's books in non-revenue or departmental capacities, most notably D7076 and D7096, which were retained at the Railway Technical Centre in Derby and used as static loads for research purposes. 4 Hymeks would ultimately survive into preservation, with D7017 and D7018 being saved by the Diesel and Electric Preservation Group and based on the West Somerset Railway, with both undergoing comprehensive restoration, with D7018 eventually returning to service in 2019 following a lengthy and meticulous overhaul, with their Brunswick green liveries complete with yellow warning panels reflecting their original BR appearance. D7029 was acquired by the Diesel Traction Group and moved to the Severn Valley Railway, and although not yet operational, it remains under active restoration, while the 4th and final survivor, D7076, represents the most unusual case, as it was eventually selected for restoration using components salvaged from its sister locomotive, which was scrapped after donating key parts. During its return to service, D7076 was temporarily fitted with a Maybach MD655 engine taken from a Class 52 Western locomotive, earning it the nickname of Hymek, with this engine being later replaced with a correct MD870 power unit recovered from a former hospital backup generator, with D7076 re-entering service on the East Lancashire Railway in 2011, painted in BR blue with full yellow ends, and continues to operate in preservation to this day. Finally, the Class 52 Westerns, by the end of the 1960s, were a regular sight on Premier Expresses such as the Paddington to Penzance Cornish Riviera, the Paddington to Birmingham Snow Hill services, and fast trains linking London to South Wales. And while they never entirely shook off questions about reliability, the Westerns generally held their own and delivered the kind of performance improvements the Modernisation Plans had promised, even if not as convincingly as hoped. Depots such as Lerma in Plymouth, Bath Road in Bristol, and Old Oak Common in London became the core hubs for Western maintenance, their staff developing a unique skill set to keep the locomotives in service, but their work was never straightforward, as spare supply was inconsistent, with many components being built under license or to non-standard specifications, with failures in items such as cardan shafts, compressors, exhausters, and fuel systems continuing to disrupt operations. In an effort to extend their utility and align them with newer rolling stock, the decision was made in the late 1960s to retrofit the Class 52s with dual braking systems, incorporating air brakes alongside the traditional vacuum setup, with this upgrade, carried out in 1968 and 1969, allowing the Westerns to haul more modern air brake freight trains and passenger stock, buying them a few more years of active service. Notably, 4 locomotives, D1017 to D1020, were never so modified and became some of the earliest withdrawals, while for the rest, this improvement came too late to change the broader trajectory of British Rail's traction policy, which was already moving rapidly towards standardisation and simplification. From 1970 onwards, the Westerns continued to carry out a wide range of duties across the Western region, holding their ground on both passenger and freight work, but despite them remaining highly capable and distinctive machines, the introduction of newer, more standardised types such as the Class 47 and the English Electric Class 50 meant the writing was on the wall. These newer locomotives, benefiting from ongoing development and better nationwide support infrastructure, began to take over the prime routes and high-profile services, though ironically, it was the initial unreliability of the Class 50s that gave the Westerns a temporary reprieve, as mechanical issues with the newer diesels forced planners to keep the hydraulic fleet active far longer than intended. Nevertheless, withdrawals began in earnest in 1973, with the first of the Class 52s to be officially withdrawn being D1019 Western Challenger in May, followed closely by D1032 Western Marksman, while the following year saw 11 more of the class consigned to the scrap line, with 1975 proving even more brutal, with 18 locomotives being withdrawn in that year alone, reducing the operational fleet to nearly half its original size. The final years were marked by a sense of inevitability, as with the completion of the West Coast Mainline electrification freeing up the Class 50 fleet for redeployment to the Western region, and with the arrival of the first high-speed trains promising a revolution in speed, comfort and efficiency, the operational rationale for the Westerns collapsed. By the end of 1976, only a dwindling handful of Westerns remained in traffic, allocated to LERA, and by 1977 just 5 were still in operation: D1010, D1013, D1023, D1041 and D1048, with the final curtain being drawn across their operational history with the running of the Western Tribute Rail Tour on February 26, 1977, hauled by D1013 Western Ranger and D1023 Western Fusilier, and just 2 days later on February 28th, the remaining locomotives were officially stood down, marking the end of not only the Class 52s, but also the era of diesel hydraulic traction on Britain's national network. However, while British Rail was quick to dispose of the redundant fleet, the passion of enthusiasts ensured that not all was lost, and the abrupt end of the Westerns triggered a surge of interest from the preservation community, and with enough time, interest and money, 7 members of the class were preserved, of which 5 had remained in traffic until the very end, and were acquired directly from British Rail before they could be scrapped: D1010, D1013, D1023, D1041 and D1048, while D1015 Western Champion, which had been taken into departmental use, was saved by enthusiasts, and D1062 Western Courier, which had avoided early withdrawal, was also secured for preservation. To summarize, the diesel hydraulics of the Western region, while incredibly stylish and mechanically innovative, were machines cleared with inevitable withdrawal from the very start of their careers, thanks to their non-standard nature and somewhat isolated positions serving only one of the British Rail regions, their origins under the ill-conceived Modernisation Plan, bringing into question whether the class should have come into existence in the first place, with the far more reasonable alternative of introducing a blanket class of diesel electrics for freight and passenger roles, as per the likes of Europe and America, should have been the course of the firm instead. Nevertheless, the diesel hydraulics introduced throughout their short careers a unique quirk of Britain's mainline railway network, as in a manner similar to the deltics of the East Coast Main Line, their dedicated transmissions and power plants led to among the most beloved series of locomotives ever to run on UK metals, and are now considered staples of the British railway preservation scene.